Those are warning sirens sounding off in Japan after North Korea launched a ballistic missile over the country.
Tensions over the Korean peninsula are running high.
Breaking news overseas, we learned just in the past hour that North and South Korea have exchanged warning shots.
With all this saber rattling, what should security experts and analysts be watching out for as the Korean peninsula continues to heat up? Our guest today is Russ Tottenham, a real-time crisis analyst with Samdesk. I'm MJ Banias, here with my co-host, Tristan Field-Jones, and welcome to SITREP, a security podcast powered by Samdesk. This is your intel report on the current tensions in Korea.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to SITREP. Our guest today is Russ Tottenham. He is one of the real-time crisis analysts with Samdesk, and he is a massive fan of North Korea. I'm just joking. He is not a fan of North Korea. Rather, he is an analyst who studies North Korea and has been doing so for years now. And we brought him on to talk about the current situation happening on the Korean peninsula, as well as the waters around it concerning the missile tests that are being launched. And for the first time on an Intel Report, I'm here with Tristan Field-Jones, my co-host. Tristan, how are you doing?
Hey, doing really well. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Really insightful. It's always fun to chat with our guest.
Russ, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. Like you said, this is a topic that I'm really passionate about. And I think that the Koreas is a subject that we need to discuss more. So I'm very happy to be here to do.
There has been a lot of press about North Korea and South Korea. There's been a lot of press about the tensions being on the rise. There's been articles about missile tests. Can you just lay down a basic primer for our audience? What's going on and who's doing what?
Yeah. So to dig into it here, the first question people want to know is who is firing, who is doing these missile tests and things like that. As per usual, the North Koreans are the main culprit. But for their part, South Korea is conducting some military drills in the area, which is well within their right. It's important to point out. Both sides have actually exchanged some artillery fire, some warning shots into what are supposed to be like demilitarized maritime zones where there's no trade. There's the strip along the border. This isn't the first time that this has happened. The first North Korea ballistic missile test was actually, I believe, in 1998. And right now we have North Korea stating that they're in the final preparations to do another nuclear test. They've done, I believe, 6 of those from 2006. And I think the last one was in 2017. The majority of their missile tests have been short-range missiles into the Sea of Japan. From 2012 onward, though, we've seen a large increase in tensions between the two Koreas and, of course, the rest of the world.
So I guess, Russ, why? Why are we seeing an escalation of missile tests? Why are we seeing this increase in the peninsula?
There's sort of two things to understand with the underlying, what drives much of the North Korean doctrine and their actions. So North Korea has a stated overarching goal of reunification of the Korean peninsula, of course, under the Kim dynasty. So, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, the first leader, and then his son, Kim Jong-il, and then now we've got Kim Jong-un. This isn't very likely to happen. In fact, it's more likely to see the Korean peninsula reunified under South Korea, which also doesn't seem likely at this point. You've got North Korea with such a grip on information coming in and out of the country. South Korea basically at this point doesn't want the economic burden of North Korea joining. So that's the one thing to understand is there's this overarching goal that North Korea has of bringing the Koreas together. The second thing that I think listeners need to understand is that there's an enormous humanitarian crisis going on in North Korea right now. It's been going on since the famine really in the 90s. So when the North Koreans lost the Soviet support after the collapse of the USSR, they went into an enormous famine. Really since then, they've just been in a terrible economic situation. They're heavily dependent on the Chinese government for aid, everything from food to fuel. So I think just understanding the North Korean military and the threat of possibly nuclear war or just the threat of war itself is really the only thing keeping the regime from being either overthrown internally or externally. So that's why it's makes sense for the government to be doing these kinds of tests. It's a signaling. So you're seeing the missiles are being launched in response to South Korean military drills as a reminder, hey, we got a military too, so don't get any ideas. If there's an American aircraft carrier in the area, guarantee the North Koreans are going to do some sort of test just as a reminder, hey, don't forget, we got pointy things too.
Russ, one of the factors that comes to mind for me, at least, is that what's been dominating the headlines has been evidently Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And when we heard about what was happening on the Korean Peninsula, I think a lot of people were like, oh, we almost forgot that there's this other crisis that's still ongoing and essentially unresolved. But I'd be curious from your perspective as an intelligence analyst, is this a way for them to maybe get away with more aggression since so much of the world is focused on Russia and Ukraine?
It could be, but I believe the North Koreans want people to see what they're doing. It's not so much what can we get away with right now, at least in my opinion. It's because the North Koreans use these missile tests and use these military parades and these military exercises as a way of communicating with the outside world. North Korea is obviously a very secluded country. They have minimal communication with other countries on the international stage. Of course, they talk to China and Russia, but so one way for them to, it's their displeasure, because they aren't going to have any other really ways to do it, is to launch these missile tests. One way to tell Japan that the North Koreans aren't very happy with how Japan is doing business with the South is to launch a missile test that happens to go over Japanese territory. And that's what we've seen this last month is that missile tests, these long-range missile tests, which used to land somewhat harmlessly in the Sea of Japan, as harmlessly as a missile test can be, now actually going over Japanese territory, some of the smaller islands. So I don't know if it's really a way for the South Koreans to do things while the world's attention is elsewhere. My opinion is the North Koreans actually want the attention. They're trying to communicate.
You mentioned Japan, Russ, and I want to get into the issues obviously this all raises. I mean, regional security is essential for Japan here. It's essential for South Korea, most likely China as well. I mean, you have what people have described as a rogue state in North Korea that, as you say, is looking for attention. How are these missile tests going to affect the security of these other Asian countries that don't necessarily want to deal with North Korea in any real sense, but are now just because they're neighbors, the neighbor's got the gun out and he's shooting over the fence. He's not hitting your house or anything, but he's taking pot shots over the backyard here. How is this going to affect the region?
This type of behavior obviously puts people on edge, and rightfully so. When you've got two countries with militaries pointed directly at each other, that's never a good thing. And the North Korean military, essentially in its entirety, is designed to defend the Korean Peninsula or to take over the South. They don't have any aircraft carrier capabilities and things like that. I don't think that Japan is worried anytime soon about the North invading Japan. But with the missiles, they've shown they do have the ability to reach out and strike that type of area. So twice in 2017 alone, North Korea actually tested missiles that, had they failed mid-flight, had a chance to land in civilian population centers of Japan. So, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see something along the lines of a North Korean or a South Korean ship being shelled off the coast, for example, talking like direct security implications in the region. I would probably predict that's the most likely thing we're going to see, is because what we've seen just a couple weeks ago was the North firing a barrage of artillery shells into what's supposed to be a maritime buffer zone between the two countries. And it was an artillery barrage of, I think, over 100 rounds they fired into the ocean. And I'm a former artillery gunner. I can tell you 100 rounds, that's a lot. You're signaling something. That's not just a regular one or two. And South Korea, for their part, just recently announced that they found some sort of North Korean merchant ship in that buffer zone, and they've fired artillery warning shots as well. So in the terms of, if you're not even North or South Korea, just having merchant ships, cargo ships in the area, it's a risk. You've got the North Koreans, who, by the way, don't announce their missile strikes most of the time. So what we're seeing is a large amount of organizations and something like airlines, for example, they've got to change their flight paths because they don't want to have their flight from Japan to wherever going through an area that North Korea is possibly going to be just on a whim sending a missile through the air.
What you bring up here, Russ, is really concerning. Not that I think North Korea would be dumb enough to purposefully target a major urban area, because there would evidently be consequences to that. But the margin of error here, if, like you say, that missile that they test doesn't actually fly over a Japanese island or a part of South Korea, but instead lands in an area and causes significant damage, that to me is the really concerning part of all this, especially since, as you mentioned, the North Koreans don't really have a lot of regard for, any advanced warning, or frankly, we know that their technology is also further behind, so it might be more prone to failure. So when you look at those factors, what are the chances that one of these tests could go very wrong and then suddenly the situation escalates rapidly?
Yeah, I think you really, it's a great question. And you hit the nail on the head with the fact that North Korean tech is not that good. They're the most sanctioned country in the world. So when you're kind of going it on your own, how good can your tech and your military be? But the missile tests, there is recorded failed missile tests. And I mean, so it's not out of the realm of possibility whatsoever for something like you said to have happened, but not, you want to take things into context. Like we're talking small percentages, but not impossible, unfortunately. Like I said, Air France actually did their no-fly zone around the Korean Peninsula because they're just, what's the point taking the risk, right? But of course, there's implications in terms of, logistics and supply chain. When it comes to that, the easiest route is the straight line. But if you've got this rogue state launching missiles into the air, now you got to plan a different route. At the beginning of October of this year, they launched a long-range missile that did reach the cruising altitude for most commercial aircraft. So there wasn't commercial aircraft in that exact area at the time, but had there been, they would have been flying at the same altitude, which is rather unnerving.
It's one of these things too, where, and MJ and I talked about this in the episode about whether or not Russia goes nuclear, which again, to reiterate, that's very unlikely at this point. But the fact is, it's still similar, right? Even if the chance of something wrong happening is 0.1%, you don't want to risk a 0.1% chance of your aircraft with 300 people on it getting blown up. Exactly. And again, it's the same thing with the nuclear tests or with the slim possibility that a nuke may be used. It doesn't matter if it's 0.1%, you still have to treat it like it's 100% chance because the consequences are potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, there's very much a more and more prevalent risk in just operating in that area of the world, whether you're through the air or on the sea. Fortunately, the Sea of Japan is actually like a relatively moderately used trade route compared to other trade routes in the region. The Japanese ports are mostly on the Pacific side of the island. The largest South Korean port is in the southeastern tip of the peninsula, so further south to where North Korea tends to conduct their missile strikes. But I mean, there's of course all sorts of ships throughout that whole region at any given time, and not just cargo ships, but fishing ships and things like that. So it's, like you said, it's a small chance, but you have to take it into consideration.
I want to get into this, Russ, because I mean, we can sort of, I think, wax philosophical about the political ramifications of it all, but let's dive into sort of the actual nitty gritty here of economic development, of business development, of companies, corporations, NGOs, governments working and trading and doing business in Korea. How is this potentially going to disrupt or impact the business and economic development of the region? Are we going to notice some people, some organizations, some companies getting a little skittish and saying, you know what, it's getting a little too warm here. Let's back off a bit and let's just see how this plays out?
It's a great question. I think that's a question anybody who is humming and hawing over starting up a business or getting a warehouse or something in the Korean Peninsula would have to honestly look at and consider, because I don't think this is going away anytime soon. People are still going to want to continue to do business with companies like Samsung and Hyundai, regardless of North Korea's actions, and unless they literally invade the South. There's a huge amount of American troops on the South Korean part of the peninsula. I think outside of Japan and America itself, there's more personnel and bases in the Korean peninsula than anywhere else in the world. I don't foresee the North Koreans invading anytime soon.
You touched on it a little bit, Russ, about how North Korea is super dependent on China, which is their only ally. And I use the term ally in quotes because some of the reading I've done indicates that China is helping out North Korea, not because they're buddy-buddy, but sort of they don't necessarily want a South Korea type economy on their doorstep. And I know that's a whole separate other topic, but it's been in the news too, where when North Korea has done nuclear tests, we've seen Chinese officials come out and say, what the hell are you doing? It's I guess calling it an ally is more of a technical term there. But I'm curious, if we explore the scenario where something goes wrong in a weapons test and we have civilians who are injured or killed in South Korea or Japan or something like that, what do we see the response being to that scenario, no matter how unlikely it is at this point? And again, I'd be curious to hear, I think we have an idea in terms of what the Western nations, if you will, would respond. But I'd be curious to hear a little bit more in terms of where you think China might factor into all this.
Fantastic question. So there's a couple ways to look at that question. And of course, different analysts have different opinions. So my opinion is that because of the fact that, the Koreas are used as a proxy between the Chinese and the Americans. Again, this is my opinion. The Americans would love to have more military bases closer to China, and China does not want more American military bases closer to China. North Korea, if you look at the borders, is a very convenient buffer between China and South Korea. If that buffer were to disappear, so if the peninsula were to be reunified under a South Korean government, without a doubt, there would be an increased American presence directly along the border with China. So it's my opinion that there's almost nothing the North Koreans could do that would elicit any sort of military response from China, because they just simply don't want the Americans on their doorstep. The human rights violations in North Korea are almost unprecedented at this point. They have labor camps, they have generational punishment where if you commit a crime and it's bad enough, your kids go to jail too with you. Some of the gulags we're talking like Holocaust level of torture and starvation and famine. So the only reason why any country would support and literally send funds and fuel and food is a situation like what China's in right now, where it's in their perceived interest that, yes, North Korea is, like you said, quote unquote, an ally, but really it's more just to keep the Americans off their doorstep. And interesting in relation to that, there's this tactic the North Koreans use where they will do something provocative that they know they shouldn't do. A missile test, a drill, a hacking campaign, whatever. And then the international community, primarily the Chinese, but it's also important to note that up until about 2015, South Korea and the United States were major donors of humanitarian aid to the North. It's not like it's just China. I think the reasoning behind the donations is different, but what they'll do is they'll do these provocative actions and elicit a response from the international community, and then they'll promise not to do it again in return for something. So it almost always perfectly lines up. If there's a big flood or something along those lines, and North Korea is clearly about to have food shortages, they'll send up a missile, and then the Chinese government will say, "Hey, don't do that," and what do you know? We'll send you a certain amount of tons of grain and you promise not to do that again. So it's a really bizarre situation that you see happen quite frequently.
What are you seeing coming in that kind of indicates to you the purpose behind North Korea's motivation to launch all these missiles and increase tensions?
Yeah, we're seeing a very large increase in the consistency of it occurring, the frequency. So in our work, we monitor all sorts of different assets, from social media to flight trackers, cargo ship trackers, things of that nature. I've noticed myself less and less cargo ships specifically in that region. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but like I said before, there's airports openly coming out and saying we're increasing the no-fly zone in this region. From an analyst perspective, it's the part that's really alarming is, like I said, the frequency and this use of what's supposed to be the buffer zone, right? There's that big border along the two countries for a reason. They never settled the war, right? It ended in a stalemate and it's technically still ongoing. The North is in a perceived constant state of war, and they think they're under threat from the Americans and the South Koreans. So from an analyst perspective, that's the part that worries me, is that you've got, them launching artillery strikes into areas that there is supposed to be a no-go zone.
We know that there's lots of corporations that have offices in South Korea, like we mentioned earlier, Samsung and Hyundai. If you're a security professional and your job is to maintain the security and safety of the people who work in South Korea for your organization, what are a few things that ought to be monitored? What are a few things that ought to be sort of considered? The risk of an actual attack on South Korean soil is very low. However, as we've discussed, the technology North Korea is using isn't exactly the greatest. We've seen incidents where accidents have occurred. There have been failed tests. What are some of the standard operating procedures? What are some of the things that security professionals ought to do to keep their assets and people safe?
Yeah, I think there's three main areas to look at. The first is sort of the least likely, and it's border skirmishes. So between the two Koreas, if you have a warehouse anywhere along the border, I'm not sure why, it seems odd, but that's where you might see some sort of conflict, tension, fighting. So of course, if you have assets in the region, I would definitely avoid that area. I think that's been well known for years, though. The second thing I would be concerned with is the maritime trade in the region. Definitely think twice about sending any sort of assets through that Sea of Japan. And if you do have contingency plans for if something goes wrong, the odds of your fishing vessel or whatever getting direct hit with an artillery strike or something is relatively low, apparently, unless you're in this maritime zone that they've been launching artillery strikes into. The third thing to consider is, we touched on it, that their technology is not that great. And the implications of that is you might have a warehouse somewhere, say in Japan or an island somewhere, and there's really no way to predict. It's like lightning. How you can't stop the North Koreans from doing this. You can't have any sort of system in place, but you can have contingency plans in place in the event that a disaster does happen. It's unlikely, but I would definitely have my assets with some sort of plan in place. What happens, it doesn't have to be a direct hit or something like that, but what happens if a missile does land in our area? What should the employees be doing? Things of that nature. Are you going to be telling even if you have, delivery operations, maybe ships or trucks or something along those lines, you need to be in constant communication with those people, because they're potentially at risk. Or if a missile strike is launched and it's detected, you need a way to tell people, hey, avoid this. Don't be going anywhere. I know this is normally where we go and fish for this species or something, but there's too big of a chance that, something could happen. I think that if a missile, heaven forbid, were to land in a population center or anything along those lines, if you weren't directly impacted, then there's a high probability of you being indirectly impacted, because, What if you need to get if you're Uber or something like that, right? And there's now this whole area that is, of course, going to be completely shut off for investigations and damage and fires and things like that. So that's definitely a few of the things I would be looking into just as mitigation and contingency plans.
Russ, one of the scenarios that we're focusing on involves, a missile or some sort of North Korean technology malfunctioning and causing potential damage to a civilian area. But I'm curious, at what point do we start taking the North Korean threats a little more seriously? Because as we've seen, and again, to go back to Russia with, how often Putin says, oh, we might be preparing nukes, and it's been false the whole time so far. North Korea uses similar saber rattling, but at what point through their actions do we start to take them a little more seriously?
Yeah, great question. And there's varying opinion on that topic. You'll find analysts who say the North Koreans would never actually launch a nuke. You'll find other analysts saying things like, it could happen tomorrow. It depends. I strongly believe that a lot of this, saber rattling or these missile strikes, it's a deterrent. It's to get people to stop considering an invasion of North Korea. So, outside of an invasion, I'm not sure there's any benefit for the regime to launch a nuclear test against anyone, because that's essentially a surefire way to get the international community to come together and agree, yeah, this country can't exist anymore in the current state that it does.
We don't have a crystal ball as to what's going to happen. But it seems to me like because we just don't know, because we don't have that crystal ball, we need to have the ability to monitor the situation on the ground sort of all the time. And
yeah, you really said it. No one can predict perfectly what the North Koreans are going to do. There's a lot of people that get paid a lot of money to try and do it. For the regular person, I think the best thing to have is some sort of global disruption monitoring system. Of course, to plug us, that's what we do. That's what we do at Samdesk is we're monitoring missile strikes as they happen. We're monitoring air traffic as it's flying through the air. We're monitoring disruptions, anything down to just the nitty gritty of road level disruptions. I think from a what can I do today right now to help with this situation, help myself, help my business, whatever it may be. It's definitely having in your back pocket something along the lines of a Samdesk platform to help you navigate those tough times of what's going on, where is it happening, and how do I get through this disruption and make it to the other side as safely and effectively as possible.
Russ, really appreciate your insight on this topic. It's been a fantastic discussion, and we could have spoken for hours on this because there are so many facets to this particular issue. And I'm sure if the situation changes, we will be chatting with you again regarding this. Are there any resources that people should consult? Anything you want to shout out to try and either understand this scenario better or to try and keep informed regarding the latest developments on the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, so there's a couple. First, I'll just give a shout out to Samdesk, our organization, who I honestly feel does just a fantastic job of monitoring this situation. Like we said, anything from the missile strikes, the artillery strikes, any sort of aircraft or cargo ship issues, disruptions, all of it. We have our finger on the pulse. So anybody who is looking to have that service, check out Samdesk, samdesk.io. In terms of keeping, if you're in general interested in this and you want to stay informed, NK News is a great source for sort of course, it's so hard to get information and news information out of North Korea, but NK News does a great job. I have a couple of books here that I just wanted to show. This one is called Nothing to Envy. It's about ordinary lives in North Korea. It's a really good insight for people who are just wondering what is life like in North Korea. It gets back into the history of the 90s as well. The second book I'll just quickly show. This one's a bit easier to digest. It's Michael Palin's North Korea Journal. He was given journalistic rights into North Korea, and there's actually an accompanying documentary with it. I believe it's on Prime. And then two organizations that I would personally like to shout out. The first one is the Human Rights Committee in North Korea. They're a DC-based think tank. They do all sorts of reports and things of that. So they're at hrnk.org, I believe. And then the second and last thing I'll plug is an organization called Liberty in North Korea, or LINK, Link. So they actually help North Koreans get out of North Korea and to South Korea through essentially human smuggling routes. Once North Koreans get to South Korea, the government helps them. They set them up in with a place to live. They get them a job, a little bit of cash to get them started. But it's extremely difficult for North Koreans to get out of North Korea. And that's what this organization does, Link.
Russ, I had no idea that a former member of Monty Python actually went to North Korea. That is fascinating. That is something I'm definitely going to check out, because the world is strange, right? You never would have expected Michael Palin, one of the members of probably the most famous comedy troupe of all time, to go to North Korea. So fantastic recommendation.
It's a bit of a coffee table book. It's a lot of photos in there. And I'll just caveat it by just quickly saying, when you're on these tourism, journalism trips to North Korea, you're seeing the North Korea they want you to see. You're not seeing the real North Korea. But if someone's, just wants to see actual pictures of the country from, recent times, it's a great resource.
Russ, thank you so much for coming on. It's great to chat. I love that we just have a North Korea expert that's like a text away. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me on, guys. I appreciate it.
And Tristan, thanks for joining on this Intel report. It's so nice to have you.
Yes, this was a lot of fun. And like I said, a fantastic conversation. And it's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to this episode of SitRep. We will see you next week. That's all for this week's Intel report. You can get in touch with the show at sitrep@samdesk.io. Make sure to click subscribe to stay on top of all our episodes, including our expert interviews and our in-depth analyses of the events shaping your world. For more, follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn by searching for @SamDeskOfficial or by visiting us at samdesk.io. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you back here next week.